Why fly line selection is so important. Fly line selection. Each type of line has a purpose. The selection of fly line is the most important investment that you will make for fly fishing on a lake. Most fly fishermen usually have a dry line that they've used at rivers, and they just take it and use it on the lakes. But in most cases, they don't do well, and because of that, they become discouraged. That is because the fly line that you use is determined by the location of the fish in the water and the behavior of the insects in the water column. It may be expensive to start. Because you need different lines to reach where the fish might be feeding, purchasing them may be expensive. But because it is so important as a part of presentation of the fly, it will help your trips be more successful.
Presentation is the process you use to imitate trout food that moves in the water. It affects how the fish will see the fly, how it moves and behaves in the water, compared to what they are eating. This presentation is used when fishing selectively. Opportunistically, the fish react to any fly that moves aggressively through the water, close to their location. We talked about this in lesson number 4. Presentation includes many elements: the fly line that you use and its sink rate, the type of fly that you use and its sink rate, the behavior of the fly in the water column, the size and color of the fly, which is covered in lesson number 3, the length or speed at which you pull the fly line through the water, which is taught in lesson number 5. Understanding the sink rate of your line. Here we see the example of different fly lines, and it shows the sink rate of lines according to their type. The sink rate of the line you buy is shown on the box that the line comes in. On the chart here on top, we can see that they're using a dry line. This is to the right. It's called a floating line here. Next would be an intermediate line. That would be considered the type 1 shown on the chart. It has a sink rate of usually 1.5 inches per second. Next, you would see a type 2 sink line, which has a sink rate of 2 inches per second, and so on. What is the sink rate of your fly? Sink rate is determined by the hook size and the type of material used on the fly and is measured in feet per second. It can be affected by weight used on the hook and the location of the weight on the hook. It also affects how the fly will be seen by the fish. On this chart you will see on the left the name of the fly, Callibaetis. We see it's a size 10. We see when it falls through the water that the tail actually falls down. And we see that it takes only 9 seconds for it to reach the bottom in water that's 6 feet deep. Comparing that to the camo line, the type 2 line, and type 3 line, you'll see that the camo line takes 48 seconds to go 6 feet. The type 2 line, 29 seconds to go 6 feet. And the type 3 line, 21 seconds to go 6 feet. How the fly falls in the water. As you can see, different flies fall at different angles. This affects how the food will look to the fish. Different materials make the fly fall in different ways, like tail down or sideways or horizontal. How the fly on your line falls. An unweighted fly tied on a size 10 hook will reach the bottom in 9 seconds. Intermediate line will reach only 14 inches in 9 seconds. The line hits the bottom 48 seconds after the fly. The fly falls faster than the line, and this causes a hump in the line as it descends, and it gets larger at both ends as the line falls. The hump is like a slack point in the line, so you have to move your floating device as quickly as you can to avoid a fish hitting the slack and spitting it out. Different lines are necessary due to insect location and behavior in the lake. Let's look at the basic locations of aquatic insects in the water column based on their normal feeding movements and their behavior. Information on insects and trout is also found in lesson number 3 and lesson number 5.
Why line selection is so important. As you can see by this chart, the insects or aquatic food that live below the surface of the lake actually have a pattern of behavior and movement as they feed. So let's look at these different insects in relation to the elements that they may inhabit. I'm using different colors to identify the different aquatic foods. You've got scuds, leeches, mayflies, caddis, damsel, and dragons. Now I don't include chironomids. In lakes, chironomids usually are about size 18 to size 22. And because of the tippet to hook ratio, that means I would have to have a tippet that's either 2 or 3 pound. In lakes, you want a tippet that's minimum 6 pounds or more. I catch many fish in the 5 to 15 pound category, and I can land a 15-pound fish even with 6-pound test. But still, it's important not to go below 6 pounds. So I use size 10 hooks on everything that I do. So scuds. Scuds like to live in rocks if they're close to the side of the lake, usually 2 or 3 feet down. And they'll actually move from the rocks into the weed beds and back in early spring. The rocks give them a lot of protection, so they'll stay there until the weather starts to warm up, and then they'll move into the weed beds and continue to feed in there. They may actually move from one weed bed to another, back and forth during the day. They don't like bright light, so the deeper the weed bed, the better, unless it's overcast days, and then they may move into a weed bed that's kind of shallow. Now, they actually move across the top of the weed beds back and forth. Oddly enough, they have a behavioral drift. They like to put themselves up close to the surface where the wind can actually blow them to another element of the lake, like a weed bed. This makes them very vulnerable. Now, when they hatch, the average hatch is about 5,000 scuds per month. I've heard that there are as many as 10 hatches a year. So when they hatch, they're small enough that they actually go in and live with zooplankton, primarily because they can feed on the zooplankton until they get large enough, and then they'll move into the weed beds and begin their normal procedure. Now, leeches are shown here in red. Leeches like to live in rocks or leaves or in weeds. They like low light conditions, so they too will move from weed bed to weed bed. Now, when insects begin to emerge and they actually move to the top of the weed bed to begin their emergent pattern, the leeches will identify with the fact that there's a large group there and actually feed on them. The fish take advantage of this because they'll feed on the emergers until they get to a certain point, and then for some reason they'll go down and feed on leeches. And they'll continue this pattern until the hatch is over. Leeches also in June, they mate. So in June they will actually move closer up to the top of the water column and right into shore to find a mate so that they can mate. Oddly enough, this makes them very vulnerable in the summer, and it's a really good time to catch leeches moving freely throughout the lake rather than close to the bottom. Now, mayflies actually can live close to stumps. A lot of stumps have algae on them, and mayflies do eat algae. Now, I've noticed in some lakes where the weed beds are further into the lake, say 50 or 100 feet from shore, that the mayflies will actually congregate in the stumps, and they may live their whole life right there and emerge from that point. If there are weed beds, they move into those weed beds, and they actually move from weed bed to weed bed. They have something called behavioral drift. Early in the morning and late at night, they like to turn around and let the current carry them from one element of the lake to another. And they'll feed in one element and then may move back to another. And they'll keep up this process until they're getting ready to emerge. Now they have what they call a false rise. That's where they'll raise a little and come back, raise a little more and come back, raise a little more and come back. They're actually building up their strength for the time when they emerge. And they'll finally make their final merge up to the top and into the surface film, and there they'll do their merging. Now, regardless of where the weed beds are located, they will do this in deep weed beds or shallow weed beds. So it's a great opportunity to catch fish using a mayfly pattern just above weed beds, especially when they're getting ready to emerge. Now, caddisflies will live in rocks or live in leaves or live in weeds. Now, caddisflies, some of them eat algae, some of them eat leaves, and some of them eat insects, and some eat all three. So you can find certain patterns of caddis in rocks or in leaves or in weed beds, and they'll move back and forth during the day. They too have a behavioral drift where they like to put themselves into the current of the lake and move from one lake element to another. They'll also move to one lake to another to feed. They also have this pattern of false rises where they will come up and go down, building their strength, getting ready for that final push to hit the surface film and emerge as adults. So they're quite vulnerable, just like mayflies, in this process. Now, damselflies have a very unusual pattern. There is a 24-month damselfly which will actually move to the shoreline in the gravel and feed on minnows. They'll do this only early in the morning, and just before the sun begins to rise, they can feel the sun's heat, or they can identify with the sun shining, and they'll move directly into the closest weed bed to them. And they will continue this pattern daily. Early in the morning, they go into the shore to feed on minnows, and then they'll move back to feed in the weed beds. Now this is only for the 24-month damselfly, which means in March you can actually catch damselflies by using a size 10 hook and a brown damsel, because by then it would be partially mature, and it'll do this pattern only if it's a 24-month damsel. Now they also move from weed bed to weed bed, and they also regardless of how far out they are in the weed bed, they'll still continue to move to shore to feed. Oddly enough, they have what's called a suicide move. That's because they like to come up close to the top of the lake, about 2 to 3 feet below the surface, and they'll just turn around and swim at that level to shore, and turn around and swim at level back. They also like to feed on mayflies that may be on the stumps that are close to the sides of lakes. Now, they like sunlight, so you'll find damselflies moving more during sunny times than overcast or overcast times. Dragonflies like the bottom. They like to move along the bottom and feed on insects. They'll move along the bottom into a weed bed and move between weed bed to weed beds. And they'll also identify with chironomid hatches. So they'll move down in there when they see the chironomids getting ready to hatch, and they'll eat down there too. So during where the mud is located in the lake, you can actually do quite well by putting a dragonfly close to the bottom and moving along this muddy area. So now you can see, because of the pattern that these insects, all of them, are moving through, you can identify that it's important to have a line that you can use just below the surface This is usually from 6 inches to as much as 4 feet. And then they also congregate in an area just above weed beds, regardless of the weed bed size. And they also like to move between weed beds. So you want a line that will allow you to fish close to the surface, or a line that will allow you to fish not so deep on weed beds, or a line that will take you even deeper onto weed beds to catch fish. That's why line selection is so important. You have to have the lines necessary to allow you to duplicate any of these patterns. The fish will be actually looking for a fly that's similar to the food that they eat, and that will be moving in a way that's similar to what they would do naturally. So you want to be able to duplicate that with your fly line.
Fly line selection, dry line. Good for fishing on the surface, but special techniques are needed to fish below the surface. Bobbers or weighted flies can be used, but they may make the bug not behave correctly in the water. And because a dry line is normally a very bright color, when you cast it on a lake, you can spook the fish. Let's take a closer look.
So now let's look at the different types of lines and how you would use them in the lake based on the information we have about how insects move and their behavior in still water. Now, dry line is not necessarily good in lakes. First of all, it has a shadow when you cast it. It can spook fish as you're casting it because usually it's bright in color. Fish only feed on about 20% of their food above the surface. Everything else is below the surface. With a dry line, when you cast it onto the lake, you actually don't move it. You just leave it perfectly still. In rivers, when you cast a dry fly out onto the river, the current of the river actually takes the fly to the fish. But in a lake, fish actually have to cruise to find their food. So if you put it here and the fish is over here, it'll be quite a long time before he can identify with it. Whereas he's looking more for insects that are moving below the surface than above. I have only used dry line one time in 16 years. And during that time, I only caught 18 fish. And I've made 16 trips a year for 16 years. So there's a lot of trips there. If you want to use dry line with a wet fly, you have to be able to control the speed of how you move the line in the water. Here you'll notice that as the fly begins to sink, you have to move the line to keep it in a certain zone so that the fish will be looking for that fly in that zone. Sometimes you can use a dry and a dropper. Some people will take a caddisfly and put it on the top as a dry fly and then put a nymph below it. The neat thing about a caddisfly is as it moves across the lake, it creates a V as it's moving very slowly. In this case, you can move the dry line because it's part of a natural behavior of a caddisfly adult on the water, and then nymph below. And so sometimes the fish will take the adult if they see it, but most of the times they'll be honed in on the emerger down below. Some people use a bobber on their line, and they select the depth that they want to use it at, and then they turn around and move at that depth. Once again, you have to control the speed of how quickly it moves, and be careful that you don't move it too quickly or that it falls too far down in the water. Primarily because you have to weight it to get it below the surface, down where the fish are, and that takes a great deal of control. Now, we talked about false rises for mayflies and for caddisflies, how they move up the column until they get to the surface to emerge. With a dry line, you would have to select the depth and then turn around and lift and raise the pole and drop it to allow this action to appear below the surface, and it's difficult to control. So although a dry line can be used on lakes, it's really not a good choice. Dry line sinking type 2. Sinking line is the preferred line to use on lakes, and they're rated by type and by how quick or slowly they sink. If expense is an issue for you, buy type 2 line first. It works good for fishing the mid depth to the bottom. Let me show you how type 2 fly line works. Type 2 line gives you a deeper option than the intermediate line. It falls twice as fast. It falls between 2 and 2.5 inches per second. Now it works real good in water that's deeper, but not very good in the shallows. Now intermediate line does work pretty good in the shallows. So it's hard to hold the fly in this upper zone with type 2 line because of its sink rate. So you use it primarily for deeper insect behavior, usually over weed beds that are 6 or 8 feet deep or even 12 feet down. You can use the rise and fall method like you do with dry line to imitate the behavior of maize and caddis over weed beds. And if you can hold it into this area, it gives you the opportunity to deal with emergers as they're moving closer to the surface of the lake. So this is a good line to start out with if money is an issue, because you can purchase a type 2 line for as little as $35. And it gives you enough opportunity that you can fish pretty much all of the lake except the upper surface, which is better with the intermediate line, and another line that I'll tell you about, which is called the hover line. So type 2 can be your first choice. Fly line selection, sinking line, intermediate. Intermediate is good for fishing just below the surface. Also, it's good to about 4 feet below the surface. Let's take a closer look at intermediate line. Now let's look at intermediate line. It actually gives you more control because it has a very slow sink rate. Typically its average is 1.5 inches per second. It allows you to deal with any insect below the surface. It's good in the first zone where emergers are. It also can be used in deeper water as well. It's designed for wet flies, and most lakes are very highly productive with wet flies more than with dry flies. Over a weed bed, you can actually use a little light weight if you want to bring it down. You'll be surprised how easy it is to control your fly with intermediate line, with the capability of allowing the fly to fall down in the water column and raise it back up. When you cast a line out and it goes out and begins to fall, it'll usually raise back up when you bring it closer, when you bring the line back in toward your pole. In doing so, this last portion going up is similar to what the mayfly and caddisfly do when they do their false rise. So you can actually mimic that action quite easily by just simply bringing the line up and allowing it to fall. Bringing the line up and allowing it to fall. I've caught lots of fish using this method. So it's really, really good, especially when you want to duplicate a false rise. So universally, intermediate line would be a good line to start with. It's usually pretty expensive, costs you probably $65. But in some cases during the year, I use this almost 70% of the time, and it's quite effective. Fly line sink tip. Sink tip line works good at depths like the type 2 line. Down the road, you may want to consider buying some sink tip line. It is a floating line where the first part of the line is about 8 feet long and is actually intermediate line. Sink tip works good at depths like Type 2 line does, but because of its design, it can actually mimic the behavior of certain types of insects underwater. Let me show you how this works. There is a specialty line. It's called sink tip. It's actually a floating line where the first 7 or 8 feet is intermediate line. So the floating line stays on top of the water and the intermediate line actually sinks. So it acts somewhat like an intermediate line as you pull it across the top of the water because it can keep the fly high in the water column. But it works very well over deep weed beds, and especially for false rises. Because of the way the line moves with the floating line above and the sinking line coming up, it imitates the movement of the false rise of caddis and mayflies very, very well. But it's very expensive. It costs about $80 for this line. I have some, but I use it very rarely. I would use it less than 10% of the time, it'd have to be in a special situation when insects are actually moving in a way where you have the advantage of a floating line and the intermediate line. Fly line sinking, hover line. Hover line is a very interesting line. It stays just below the surface. It's a special line for special situations. Let me show you how it works. Now last we have a very special line. It's called hover line. Now it came out some years ago, and in some places it'll be hard to find because some manufacturers actually stopped manufacturing it. If you can find some, get it. And here's why. The intermediate line is, the hover line is good just below the surface. It's actually a floating line, but when you cast it out across the top of the water, when you jerk it, the line begins to fall. It's said that the fall rate is about 1 inch per second, but it's actually less than that. And oddly enough, you pull the line so it drops below the surface. Then when you continue to move the line at the point where it drops below the surface, it'll actually stay in that area. So you can keep the line as little as 6 inches below the surface and continue to keep it there as you move it toward the boat. So it's very, very effective in that way. It's great for just subsurface. Now, where there are lakes that have stumps on the shoreline, usually the water above them is only about 18 inches deep. So I haven't found another good line that works well over those stumps except the hover line. It'll actually allow you to work over the top of these stumps and not get caught on any of them because it continues to stay at the rate that you pull it. So it's really, really cool, and it works very, very well in shallow water. You can work with it over weed beds and use the same behavioral patterns that you would use with the other lines. Now there is another advantage. There are a lot of times there are weed beds that are in water, let's say about 5 feet deep, or even 8 feet deep. But the weeds move toward the surface, and there's a space between the top of the weed and the top of the water, and it's usually about 1 foot or 18 inches, just like the logs. Interestingly enough, when you have a fish finder, if you're looking through the weed beds on a side view, the fish can actually be hidden in the weeds, and there'll be so many weeds there that you can't identify that the fish is present. In between these weeds, it's actually like a channel, and the fish will move through that channel and back, and you won't see them moving back and forth because they're down here where the large weeds are. The hover line allows you to pull a fly right over the top of these weeds, so the fish that's down below, like this, sees that fly and he just comes right up and grabs it and goes right back down. And this is the only line that I've found that's been effective. Now, some people try using dry line over the top, and that can work, but then again, it's only for a dry fly. if they turn around and use a dry and a dropper, then they've got to make certain that it's so that the dropper is so close to the other that the fly won't fall because of its sink rate into the weeds as you're pulling it across. Whereas this line gives you that extra punch over shallow water and the opportunity to catch fish that are hidden and can't be seen in view by your fish finder. So there's the 4 or 5 lines that I recommend, that I have and that I use. And I would suggest over time that you get one of each of these, except maybe the sink tip line. I use that very rarely, but I sure use this a lot, especially when the lake water gets low and there's very little water above obstacles like weeds and logs. So there you go. Consider what you need to do in the purchase of the lines that you plan to fish with, and over time you will begin to understand which is better and how to use them, and that's what makes you proficient enough to have a day that's so successful you can walk away with catching and releasing almost 50 to 80 fish. It's a great way to fish. So good luck.